Okay, welcome to another Atypling Philosopher video. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking to Dave Fletcher for a number of reasons, not only because he's written an absolutely awesome book, but because I have to admit, I was a bit of a fanboy of a podcast that I think was and still is like the greatest audio podcast I've ever listened to. I think I've listened to every episode out of the over 100 episodes. And it was called Reasonable Doubts. And it was himself, Dave Fletcher, that is, Jeremy Bean, Luke Galen, and eventually Justin Shieber. And they were such an awesome team and I'm such a Pavlovian dog sort of person that whenever I go and mow the lawn these days, I have an instant Reasonable Doubts flashback because I used to mow the lawn and listen to their podcast. And so now I can't mow the lawn and not think Reasonable Doubts and listen to the voices in my head of Dave and Jeremy and Luke and whatnot. So anyway, Dave, welcome to this interview. I hope you are well.
I am. Thank you so much. And I didn't realize that Reasonable Doubts was such a great podcast to mow the lawn to, but that's a good endorsement. I like that.
So what it is with me is that because I'm so pressed for time and I want to do so many things, I can never not multitask. So if it's a kind of mindless job I have to do, there is something going on in my head. There's some like audio or visual kind of stimulus, allowing me to kill two birds with one stone. But it's such a good podcast because it married so many things. And in fact, I think it's responsible for getting me really interested in the psychology of religion, which is, what Luke Galen was on that for.
Yeah.
Because I think we argue so often about the content of religion, but not why people believe. Was that something that became sort of more and more prevalent for you guys as you went on doing the podcast?
It was, I don't think it was something that we intended necessarily to start with. Obviously, we had Luke. He's a psychologist, teaches psychology. So that was there. But it kind of, as we continued to develop the show and figure out what we were doing, that became more and more a part of it. And I think it's a really effective way to understand religion and why people believe what they do. It's one thing to talk about the contents of the Bible and look at all this weird stuff, but then to talk about why people believe it and why they continue to believe it in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and that sort of thing is a really, I think it's an effective way to help people understand not only religion, but how we work in terms of religious beliefs.
Yeah. And your podcast was set, I believe, your Grand Rapids, Michigan people.
Yes.
You described as, I think, was it the bra strap? No, was it
the clasp on America's Bible bra? Yes,
the clasp on America's Bible bra. That was it. The delightful metaphor. So how was? Can you talk a little bit about your journey into atheism or your experience of religion and atheism? Give us a little bit of history of how you came to be an atheist.
Sure. Growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's a very conservative area. It's a very religious area. I was raised in the Christian Reformed Church. Now, how that's different from other of the various denominations, I couldn't speak very intelligently to that because it's all I know. We don't have a lot of fun. I know that. It's not one of the churches where you clap and saying it's a very white denomination, very much rooted in the Dutch, which are my people as well. But I was raised in the church, went to church twice every Sunday, went to Christian schools from preschool all the way through high school. And I can't say that I ever had the experiences that some folks did with religion where they accepted Jesus into their heart, where they had that moment of transformation, because it was just always what I had. And given that Christian Reformed Church is not super big on evangelizing and speaking in tongues and all of the fun pageantry of some other Protestant groups, it was a very intellectual kind of religion, in that it was they aimed at the head much more so than at the heart when talking about religion. So I never had those overwhelming feelings of the spirit coming into my body and echolalia and all of that, but it was just kind of what it was. And as I grew up, I experienced a lot of the hypocrisy in the church, from both specific people within the church and then kind of the church in general. And as I came to the end of my high school career, which I went to Grand Rapids Christian High, shout out to the Eagles out there, I was starting to have a little bit more questions. And
what do you mean by the hypocrisies? What can you exemplify that?
Sure. There's a lot of talk of family, and here I'll give a really personal, specific, and of course it speaks to the fact that all atheists have daddy issues, as we've been accused of. But my growing up, my father, who's a terrible person, so feel free to judge accordingly. He was sleeping with a 19-year-old employee of his, whose parents were heavily involved in the church. In fact, the choir director and an elder in the church. And they told my father that if he needed a place to stay, he could move in with them to get away from my mother, as though my mother were the problem in him having an affair with a 19-year-old girl. So that sticks with you a little bit. You have these people literally standing in front of church every week and singing God's praises and talking about living a holy life and yada, yada, yada. Meanwhile, they were like almost directly trying to split up my family. Probably the worst part of that, though, was my mom, being a good Christian woman, would have never considered divorce as an option. So she ended up staying in a truly terrible marriage until finally my father ran away from home when I was 18. And to see the damage that her beliefs did to her in forcing her to blame herself, to stay in an unhealthy marriage, and so on and so forth. And then even after my dad abandoned us, stole from us, left us without a home, the church still refused to take sides on it, which to me was not particularly a ringing endorsement of the church's stance. And so I started I still of course believed, but I started to move towards I'm more spiritual than I am religious, which is now the kind of thing that makes me want to slap someone for. But I was.
But it's quite common though. I mean, I was speaking to Derek Lambert of Mythvision. I've done a lot of talks with him recently, and I've interviewed him on his deconversion. And his was a movement from sort of Calvinism, from sort of home church hardcore through to Calvinism, and then then embracing a more esoteric kind of a understanding of religion that's generally more kind of deistic, spiritualistic, but and then that's that bridge from that organized, very formal religion through to atheism, and that rather than just like, right, that's it, I don't believe at all. There's very often this morphing through that, over that bridge to atheism.
Yeah, for sure. And I was CRC is very much rooted in Calvinism. I know my tulip, um, but and and it was also at that same time where I was starting college and I was meeting people for the first time that I couldn't assume were of my same belief system, because really everyone I knew up until that point was from my school and from my church, and we were all Christians. So I started
This
to,
is the difference between, sorry to interrupt, this is the
yeah,
difference
no,
between the UK and the US. That sort of scenario where you are just brought up within a church environment where they are your family, your friends, your community, your everything. And then and then eventually when you're at the age you're talking about, sort of 18, are you?
yeah,
Then starting to meet people from outside of that, it's just nothing that would really happen anywhere in Britain, or
no,
certainly not into the degree it does in America, where, as soon as you hit primary school in the UK, you are just meeting all sorts of people, and
right.
at school, right from the age of 5 onwards, is just a mix of everyone, and you just don't get that. So it's a really interesting shift, a whole different paradigm to the UK experience.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, in West Michigan in general, it's a very homogenous sort of area. Yes, there are Protestants and there are Catholics, but it's pretty much it's largely white, largely middle class, and we're um, the outliers are the people who are not um, religious, and specifically either Catholicism or Christian Reformed or a similar denomination. So, yeah, once you start meeting people who have different beliefs, and I just start thinking, like I've been told, these people are going to hell because they haven't accepted my version of Jesus. Believing that homosexuality was a sin, believing in all of the patriarchal structure of the church, and starting to question that. Um, it was a slow process, and then kind of it was very quick. Like, started off for the first couple years, it was this gray area, that kind of deistic, like spiritual, but I still believe this stuff, but I'm not really feeling it. And then kind of all at once, I was like, yeah, it doesn't work for me anymore. This isn't, I don't believe this. And that was when I reached out to the local free thought community, which I didn't even know existed up until that point. And pretty shortly after that, I went to a Catholic college and started a free thought group, eventually a CFI college group there. And it was kind of in starting that I connected up with the other guys from Reasonable Doubts. And at that point, I was fully immersed in it, and spent a lot of my time reading and arguing online, and all of that fun stuff.
Yes, and then here you are now. I mean, that's really interesting, and I suppose it also talks about the importance of having structures and communities of free thought in place. Because I think you've been active in the free thought community over time, haven't you?
Yeah,
And the people associated with the podcast as well. And it's really important that there are visible groups of people there to so that people aren't just cocooned and then think that if they do have doubts that there is no way out, that there's nowhere to go. And now with the internet, I think it's even very different to what it was 20 years ago.
yeah.
And I think that's great. The movement is gathering momentum, and the demographics are shifting, and I think the writing's on the wall. Have you seen a change?
Yeah, and actually one of the things that I find really interesting is that cities like New York and Los Angeles, big cities, have much less robust communities when it comes to the non-religious, free thought, whatever groups. It's these areas like Grand Rapids that is a strongly conservative religious area where you have this really good sense of community with our free thought group, because this is where it's needed. Like in
Yeah, I can imagine why that is totally the case as well.
yeah,
You're having to plant your flag down and state your claims to who you are, because you're fighting against such a tide against you that you almost need to be more overt with your with your efforts to establish a community. Whereas in these big urban centers, it's just like, well, no one gives a shit and
exactly.
whatever, and everyone believes loads of different things, and we just live in our own little apartments in a city, and you struggle to find a sense of community at all, arguably. I'm generalizing, but yeah, I can
Yeah.
see that.
Well, and that's why the internet is a total game changer for the atheist community, because there are plenty of small towns where there isn't any community, at least not a visible community, because it's not safe or there's just not enough people to do that. And it was my way of getting into the community as well, was to find people online and then podcasts. And I listened to Point of Inquiry with DJ Grothy for years and years, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, et cetera, and so forth. And that was really when we had first come up with the idea of the Reasonable Doubts podcast. It was going to be specifically focused on Michigan and dealing with stuff there. And because we wanted to offer something to people out there who didn't know that there was a community here. And luckily, we rethought that and figured we could, broaden the scope and reach people. And eventually we did, all around the world.
Yeah, I mean, even from the UK, I was fascinated in when you were doing national US news that was prevalent, and that was relevant to the free thought community. I was just lapping it all up. I just had the bass line of the music of the song going through my head just then. So on that podcast, so here's a segue into your book. So on that podcast, you presented little snippets of mythology
Yeah.
every episode, or most episodes, particularly. I don't know if you did at the beginning. I think this
No, it
you did
started in slightly later on,
yeah.
but yeah.
So what got you interested in mythology in such a way that you eventually kind of sort of formalized it a bit more?
So as a kid, I was super into Greek mythology. We had actually, my sister had a book that I stole from her, and it was the kid's book of Greek myths. And I really loved that stuff because it was kind of like religion, in that we're talking about gods and miracles and all of that, but it was also kind of like superheroes. And so I really got into Greek mythology as a young kid, and it kind of always hung around in the back of my head. I remember in like fourth or fifth grade doing a paper on Dionysus, which is, I wish I still had that, because that would have been hilarious to look back on. But it wasn't really until uh, shortly after we started doing Reasonable Doubts, when I finished college and I was looking to teach secondary school, and there were no jobs. And Jeremy from Reasonable Doubts was teaching as an adjunct professor at a school here in Grand Rapids, Kendall College of Art and Design. Shout out to the Bulldogs. And they had asked him, because he taught philosophy classes if he wanted to teach a class on mythology. And he was like, not really, but I know someone who is a teacher and could do that. And so they contacted me, and I went in for what I thought was an interview. And it turned out it was just, you're hired because classes start in 2 weeks. So do what you can. And so I fell into teaching mythology and kind of started doing it in all of
that's just such lax employment
it's
protocol. It's just hilarious.
Not responsible at all. I had degrees, and I
Fair enough.
Yeah, I definitely should not have been hired that easily. But so I started doing that, and when I started, it kind of brought back all of my childhood fascination with Greek myth. And for the first year or so, I taught almost exclusively classical, which is a term that I hate, but Greek and Roman myth.
Which is fascinating, because I mean, when we come on to talk about the book in a minute, you are very explicit in your refusal to include those pantheons in the book, because they are so ubiquitous, right? That you just see so much of it everywhere. But anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So, and I of course grew to hate Zeus with a fiery passion, and I started digging into other things because I wanted to do more. And so I started teaching Egyptian and Mesopotamian and Norse and Japanese and Chinese, and it just kind of kept going from there. And this bookshelf you can see behind me is about half of my collection of books on mythology. I just grabbed them up and started absorbing them, and it really became the best job I've ever had, quite frankly, that I fell into by accident. And I find it endlessly fascinating. There's always more stuff out there to learn, and new perspectives. And it's the greatest stories in the history of the world. Like, these are stories that have been passed down for thousands of years for a reason. Not because they're true. I don't believe the world was created out of the corpse of a very large being, as so many cultures do, but because they resonate with something in us, as a form of pre-scientific understanding, early form of psychology, anthropology, all of this stuff. It's all here, and you can see social structures at work in the myths. And it's just it dug its claws into me and has kind of taken over my life at this point.
Yeah, well, that's a good time to introduce, but I mean, we'll talk about some of those ideas you just mentioned. The book is Myth Education, and it's a beautiful book. I love this book. It's just lush. And you've written it, obviously, with an afterword by Arthur George. Forward by Arthur George, and an afterword by Carl Siegfried, both of whom are mythologists. Yep. And what is great about this is it's thematically arranged into the different geographies of the pantheons that you deal with. Obviously, in a book, you have to be selective because there are as many gods and pantheons as there are cultures in the world. And so you were careful to select, but it's just the fact that there's such beautiful artwork in the book as well. I mean, you collected artwork from all sorts of people with different styles, and different interpretations of the gods. And it's just a lovely book to look through and enjoy, not only for the aesthetic value of the great artwork that's in there, but also I think your voice comes through as an author really well. I think you're telling these stories with not a little hint of humor, that comes through. There's interesting sort of twists on, like, ideas of modern social justice, whilst looking at, obviously, a politically deeply incorrect mythological history, and just that kind of interesting intersection there. And I think it's just a wonderful book. How did it come about?
Well, so it actually, I think you were the one who planted the seed of an idea for this, because you had contacted Reasonable Doubts and said, "Hey, have you guys ever thought about doing a book?" And I have wanted to write since I could write, and that was probably years before I started doing it. And then on the podcast, I did these polyatheism segments where I would spotlight a particular god or goddess and talk about them for a couple minutes and why they are worth not believing in. That's still a solid catchphrase. And
another god not worth. Was it another god worth not believing in, or not?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of that, and I'm also proud of the term polyatheist, though I didn't make that up myself. Because there are many gods worth not believing in. But so I started doing that, and I essentially had created all of these essays on various deities, and I thought I could keep going with this, and I can expand this out, and I can delve deeper and develop this into a full-on book. And so I set to work. And
where did you get the artwork from? I mean, were they people at the college? Were they people you knew?
Yeah, I think,
of course, it was an art and design college, wasn't it?
Yeah, I teach at an art school. So and one of the things that I've done with my class since the very beginning is have them do an art project inspired by myth, where they're making connections between different cultures, or between the cultures and pop culture now. And so I had gotten all this wonderful art throughout the years from various students. And when I was thinking about, for me, a lot of mythology is very visual. I mean, look at the Egyptians. That's the art there is fantastic. You get to India, and you've got all these colors and arms and heads, and it's just it's a visual feast. And so it was important to me to include some of my students in that. So I think there may be one piece in there that's from not a former student of mine, but almost all of them are former students of mine who had been through my mythology class. And I reached out to them and said, "Hey, would you be interested? I'm trying to make a book out of the class, essentially." And I got some really wonderful artists. There are some pieces in there that are just gorgeous, and I feel very lucky and spoiled to have my name on a book that has such lovely pieces of art in it. But
definitely, I mean, it's I can't sing the praises of the book enough. I'm just looking at it now. I know it's very simplistic, the cover, but it's so stylishly simplistic. It's just beautiful. It's just a beautiful book. So what do you think, talking about mythology in general, what do you think that we can learn from mythology now? I mean, what does it teach us about the human condition, about the human psyche, and about our past? Obviously, it teaches us what people believed,
right,
in a very sort of simple way. But what can we learn from it? Talk us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's part of it is entertainment, and the reason that these stories have been passed down for centuries, oftentimes orally until the fairly recent past, there's a reason that these stories have survived, and it's because they're entertaining, and they speak to us on a base level of, this is fun, this is horrifying, this is whatever. they resonate with us, but they also truly help us understand human history and why we think the way we do, and continue to ask more questions as well. Like, think of, for example, the biblical creation myth of Adam and Eve, right? That establishes a patriarchal structure, right? Adam is on top, literally, and if you believe the story of Lilith, in all the ways. But because Eve was the one who introduced the sin into the world, and you see that as that justifies centuries of a patriarchal culture, Judaism and into Christianity. But then you can find that same sort of thing justified through slightly different means elsewhere in the world. Japan, you have the story of Izanagi and Izanami, and Izanami, the female of the two, when they have their marriage ceremony, she speaks first. She greets him before he greets her. And because of that, the first child they have is this leech monster. And that story, to this day, is still used in Japan to justify why men should be in charge, why men should speak first and women should demur to men. Because when the woman goes first, you get monsters, right? And so there is a huge relevance to these stories in understanding the social structures that we have in place now, and the way we think of the world, going from most cultures where you have a plurality of gods to now most of humans on the earth believe in religions that are monotheistic, which is crazy rare in the annals of mythology, and that's a fascinating aspect.
I mean, it's interesting that in the same way that you get sort of convergent evolution, which is where different sort of threads of evolution or instantiations of evolution in different geographical places, for example, might lead towards an eye, right? And there's a version of an eye here and a version of an eye over there and a version of an eye over there, and they've all evolved in different ways. There's convergence of evolution of motifs and ideas that you get from different cultures around the world, where you see, like you've already said, you've got here's this version of that in Japan. You have these universal human ideas and motifs that are developed with their own little twist, maybe, but in all these cultures, or many of these cultures. And I think, it's interesting, and it presents a sort of comparability where you can compare like this myth to that myth, because they are basically the same myth, but in different contexts.
Well, and that's just to be clear, because we're starting to sound very Joseph Campbell here, Hero with a Thousand Faces idea, where, I mean, his idea is essentially the monomyth. Everyone's telling the same story, and culture distorts that version of the story. I don't like Joseph Campbell. Actually.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I wasn't quite saying that, but yeah.
No.
I see where you're coming from.
But for people watching, and because I think it is the culture that actually makes the myth. It's not distorting it.
Yeah.
It's the differences that make them interesting. You can go very broad and say, oh, look, hero stories are the same, kind of. He comes up with a list of 12 things that some of them hit, but not all of them. I mean, you take Jesus and Dionysus and Rama, and you can tick off a few of the boxes for each of them, but you're cherry picking. Joseph Campbell, a big fan of picking the stuff that fit and ignoring the stuff that didn't. And it's only by looking at multiple cultures that you can see, yes, there are similarities, but it's the differences too that are just as fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something I keep talking about in terms of intertextuality. So when you talk about how, the Bible, the flood myth in the Bible, and then you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis, and you say, Christians will say, well, look, they're different, so they can't be that can't be drawing on that, and this happens all the time with sort of biblical intertextuality. Whereas what you should be saying is, well, actually, it's the similarities that are telling you things.
Yes.
The similarities, whatever, they're similar because they're drawing on the same sources. They're drawing on each other, or one to the other. But this one is different, and the difference is what. So, for example, in the biblical myth of the flood, it's the differences that are telling you something important. That's what's telling you things about the Hebrew kind of culture and theology here. It's that humans are sinful, and they are being punished. They're not just noisy, and that's why they're being wiped out. They are taking on the blame for their own, what happens to them, and so on and so forth. So or not, we can argue about that, but it's the differences that are interesting and important in delivering the important messages of that culture.
Yeah, and there are flood myths throughout most of the world. We have them. There's indigenous American flood myths. There are Chinese flood myths. There are Mesopotamian, of course, included in that area. We have the biblical story of Noah, and we can look at those and go, okay, we have all of these flood stories either because A, there really was a worldwide flood where only one survivor and their family survived, or we can say floods are a very common natural disaster, things that affect cultures differently. For example, Egypt doesn't have a destruction of the world by flood story, because in Egypt, the flooding of the Nile was a good thing, and it was part of
I was just going to say that is completely unsurprising, because people live by rivers for fresh water, and because flooding provides fertile ground, right? So most humans are going to live by water. So therefore, and rivers flood. So therefore, most humans are going to experience flooding in early cultures. Why do we have flood myths in every culture? Not because there's a global flood, but because they are all living in areas that flood locally. There you go.
Yep.
So on and so forth.
Yeah, and it's fun to look at the different flood myths, because you have, like, Genesis, the story of Noah, where it is very much a condemnation of humanity that causes the flood. There are other times when it is the gods themselves, like in China, you have a Gong, the dragon like being, who throws a tantrum and causes the sky to break open and flood the world. So humans aren't to blame for that one. And then you also have different ways of how the flood is resolved. In the Noah story and in most of the Mesopotamian stories, like we see with Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, which are essentially the same story. You have this almost comical image of the entire world being covered with water, and then it takes days and days for the waters to recede. You end up on a mountain, blah 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 blah. Whereas one of the many flood stories in China, you have a much more realistic flood, in that it takes years to recover from the damage of the flood. And it's not a single person or single family that survives. It's just this devastation to the larger community. And it takes a god, in fact, years to help repair all the damage that's been done, which speaks a lot to the idea of community. And of course, there's also monsters involved, so that makes it fun.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
What in all the many sort of wonderful accounts of divine entities that you have here, gods and goddesses, what's your favorite god in there? What's your favorite story?
So it's like choosing my favorite child. It's very easy. No,
Yeah, I was just gonna say I could do that, no problem.
I have there are different ones that speak to me at different times. One of my favorites, and in fact the only one I have tattooed on my body, is the Egyptian god Thoth, or Thoth, depending on how you choose to pronounce it. He's the ibis-headed god of writing and magic, and is the Egyptians believed he was the force behind all written works, both human and divine. And as a librarian and as a person who likes books and words and all of that, he is certainly has a special place in my heart.
Nice.
Loki is of Norse myth. He's a popular one now, thanks to Marvel's version of him. But truly, the Norse version of him is quite different from Marvel. But he is this wonderful trickster figure.
Loki was cool before Tom Hiddleston. I was there first. He says David Fletcher. I was into Loki before he was cool.
Yeah, exactly. Tricksters tend to be some of my favorites. The African figure of Anansi, who's the keeper of story. Again, it all comes back to stories with me. That's a big thing. But tricksters are the best because they're dynamic. They are, as opposed to a lot of the gods who are just always going to be doing the same thing. You have tricksters that exist in these liminal spaces between the worlds of God and man, and between oftentimes genders and everything else. So my favorite character, broadly speaking, would be the trickster figure, which, boy, there are so many great ones.
Yeah, I mean that kind of like mischief. Everyone likes a bit of mischief. So, what way can you connect mythology from around the world to Christianity, or even to sort of Judaism as the foundation of Christianity in the Hebrew Bible? How obviously, not obviously, but the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh is this monotheistic God, but before that you had henotheism or monolatry, where this argument that or it's not an argument, it's just a fact that Yahweh was in a council of gods, or a pantheon of gods, and then as the Canaanites became the Israelites, you had this initial period where they were saying this is the main God, this is the coolest god out of all the gods. It's not that the other gods don't exist, it's that Yahweh is just the main one, or the cool one, or the one that we like. And then that morphed into monotheism, which is no, the other gods don't exist, it's just Yahweh. But then you get these fossilized elements of that journey throughout the Hebrew Bible, where you get consorts and divine councils and Baal cycles and all this kind of stuff, yada yada yada. And in that context, and understanding that context, what else do you think sort of mythology from around the world, are there parallels with Christianity? Are there parallels with Judaism and the Hebrew Bible? What are the connections you can make?
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as parallels go, we've already talked about floods, creation myths. Of course, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, you will see that there are two creation myths back to back in Genesis. You have the first one where it's creation through word, let there be light. And then you have the second one where it's creation through materials. Adam is made from the dust of the earth and breathed into. It's a very hands-on thing. Also, you have there essentially two different versions of the creator God. You have Elohim and you have Yahweh. And now, of course, we say both of those are referencing the same God. Well, probably regional variations that we see in elsewhere in the Middle East as well. The god El, or El Shaddai, I should say, is a Mesopotamian figure whose name also gets incorporated into Judaism. But
which speaks of the documentary hypothesis, or the multiple sources, where you have different sources being threaded together to try and make a sort of
yes,
coherent narrative. But there, as I said, there are sort of fossilized elements of, well, that's your god from there, this is the god from the north, and this is, the Yahwists, and then you have these different elements being combined within Hebrew Bible. But sorry, I interrupted.
yeah, no, you're exactly right. And that's, I mean, the story of Noah is a weird one because it's patched together like within the story. At least with the creation, you get one and then the next one. With Noah, you have these different sources talking like sentence taking turns. But to me, the study of myth is important in regards to the world religions today, particularly the Abrahamic religions, because they tend to be the ones that cause the most trouble. Is we talk a lot about vaccines these days, right? You're vaccinated, right?
Yeah.
I don't need to put my mask on. Okay, good. I worry about that, but studying myth is like a vaccine against religion, because the more you look into these things, the more you see those common threads, those common ideas, the easier it makes it to see that, this story of Gilgamesh is ridiculous, right? He fights a giant bull. There's a beast man that becomes his friend. Yeah, it's totally queer, but and you can go, oh, that's so silly that they used to believe that, and then you look at the Bible and go, oh,
Yeah.
wait a second, these are the same kinds of ideas, and do they have value? Absolutely. They helped people understand the way the world worked, but does that mean we should hold to those ideas? Or do we go, this is part of human history, this is one way of understanding the world, but now we have better tools. And I think that it really, without even specifically talking about the Bible, although it does obviously come up quite often, you can start to see the commonalities and start to recognize the absurdity. Like, this God judges people for this bizarre thing and punishes them in this weird way. Well, isn't that kind of just like Christianity, where we've decided shellfish are bad, and Judaism, I suppose, and that sort of thing. And so it can help you build up an immunity to the ideas of other.
I love that analogy. That's really nice, and it's this. It really allows you to see that Christians and Orthodox Jews are just really arguing for some kind of biblical exceptionalism, where they say, yeah, I understand that's a myth. Yeah, that's obviously a myth. Yeah, that's just nuts. That's a myth. This is a myth. Oh, this one here, no, this one's true. This one's true because it's in the Bible. But that was a myth. But once you start really looking at that, so I've interviewed Josh Bowen, who's an ancient Near East Assyriologist, and he was a fundamentalist Christian, and Hebrew and Greek, and lots of qualifications. And it wasn't until he started studying the ancient Near East with Assyriology that he deconverted, and he did it. He said it was fascinating. He said he did it in 48 hours because once he saw, and he was a witnessing like hardcore Christian, but once he saw the cultural and historical milieu in which the Hebrew Bible is set, and seeing all these parallels, and just understanding that this is just a slightly distorted version of this and this and this, there was no rational way to reconcile that. And he's like, well, if the Old Testament falls apart, if the Hebrew Bible falls apart in this kind of way, theologically speaking, and as in some kind of exceptional book, then the New Testament falls apart, and if that falls apart, my faith's gone. So he like deconverted within 48 hours as a result of getting into Syriology. And I think that kind of that's kind of what you're saying, which is, okay, it wasn't a vaccination up front to protect you, but you understood that that's how it works. And yeah, I think that's fascinating.
And it's with the biblical exceptionalism and so on. It's certainly the way I was raised. It was sort of in a vacuum, right? And presented as though the Bible were written in a vacuum. Like this is their stories, but it's clearly not the case. I mean, all of the neighboring people have similar stories, and you can see the Hebrew Bible is actually written down during, or most of it, during the period of exile in Babylon. And it's at that point where they are very intentionally trying to distinguish themselves from their oppressors. So that's when they become, they codify their beliefs as having henotheism, our God that is above all other gods. You see it in the Ten Commandments, right? There's no gods before me. That's very different. That's not a monotheistic idea there.
No.
That is very much acknowledging that other gods exist, but this one is, like you said, this is the coolest. And when you start to get a broader view of the world, just like many of us do when we go to college, right? You start to see that this is not special. This is not unique. This is of a piece of all of the other things around it. And it's fascinating. It's, but it's not, it wasn't written down by the hand of God himself and handed down. It was written by people who existed amongst other people and took their ideas and altered them to their own purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. So Professor Francesca Stavrakalopoulou, I think whether I got that right.
You say it, not me.
So she's just written The Anatomy of God, which is a really interesting book that I've started reading, talking about how Yahweh has a body is basically your classic old school God, very, very anthropomorphic. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, that's kind of like edited away as you move towards this kind of monotheism. So God isn't like hanging around with feet and arms and legs and whatever.
Well, you do have the story where Moses is blinded after seeing God's butt.
Right.
He hides in the cliffside, and God puts his hand over him to cover it, and then his hand goes away as he walks away. Moses sees God's back, and his face shines for days afterwards, right?
Well, I mean, who wouldn't be like glowing with, I've just seen God's butt?
Yeah, it's a very, very silly story that gets overlooked far too much, because it's, I mean, that's a delight. You have a
quite, I mean, it's but yeah. Well, actually, I'll come on to that in a second, which is how many of the stories, particularly some of the ones that you mentioned in here, are quite rude, actually, and not fit for kids. In fact, so before I go on to that point I was going to make, do you want to just talk about that? How actually this isn't a book necessarily for kids, right? This has some interesting themes and interesting plots.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I love mythology books for kids because they have to go so far to avoid talking about what's really happening. Because I mean, Zeus is a serial rapist, right? Odin is also a serial rape. There are so many, and in Egypt, of course, you have incest.
Zeus is a serial golden showerist.
Yes.
I'm not really sure what's going on there, but I was interesting because I once was teaching some kids about Icarus and Daedalus, and then I was talking to them about who Daedalus was, and this great sort of inventor of stuff, and then we got onto the Minotaur, and I was going to show them a video, and it was a TED education video.
Oh yeah, those are great.
But it was also like, it's lucky I watched it first, because it was like talking about how the Minotaur was created, which is to do with impregnating a bull, and there was like, it was just weirdly sexual and bestial, and I was like, yes. Yeah, no, I don't think I'll be showing them this. I'll talk over that.
Which, yeah, and it's tricky, and frankly, I don't know how people do it with a straight face a lot of the time, because these stories aren't for kids, and I think it is important that that kids do learn about this stuff, but it's there. I mean,
did Greek kids did Greek kids learn that though? Like, they must have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So it's not for our modern sensibilities, but they obviously had different sensibilities way back when.
Right, and of course, with prudish monotheistic religions coming into play, then you lose a lot of that. But
you were going to point at Medusa behind you.
Yeah, I've got this Medusa poster behind me. That is, I mean, there are multiple versions of the story of Medusa, of course, but one of them is that she becomes this monster after being sexually assaulted by the god Poseidon. She's the one who's punished because she gets assaulted in Athena's sanctuary. So she's a priestess of Athena, and she gets sexually assaulted by Poseidon in her temple. And Medusa is the one that is cast out and literally transformed into a monster for it.
Classic victim blaming.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes her a very strong metaphor for when we're having discussions about the way we treat victims of sexual assaults. And the idea of victim blaming is very strong in mythology, and to kind of paint that out and say, like, well, yeah, but this was the way they saw it, that's important. But you also have to acknowledge that we as a modern audience can have a different interpretation, which helps us understand not only the story, but the culture that was telling it as well. So yeah, I think you do have to include the nasty bits, some of which are upsetting, some of which are incredibly violent. The Aztec were certainly not the only culture to do human sacrifice, but they did some particularly nasty forms of human sacrifice, where a person would be skinned alive, and then their skin would be worn by a priest for various ceremonies. And it's important to acknowledge the atrocities that people are capable of committing simply when they believe that it's what their god or gods want them to do. That being said, there's also a lot of very lowbrow humor in mythology as well. There are dick and fart jokes aplenty.
Yeah, well, so it's been a long time since I've read this book, and I do apologize for that, but I do seem to remember sort of Egyptian like penis.
Yeah, well,
happening a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the Egyptians are all about the penis. I mean, a pyramid is basically an earth penis, right? A obelisk is a giant penis. You have stories of Horus and Seth and the contendings, which is essentially this genre of Egyptian literature, where it's the battle between the falcon-headed god Horus and the Seth animal-headed god Seth, fighting for control of the throne of Egypt. And there's attempted sexual assault, and then one of the pardon the expression, climaxes is where Horus takes his semen, which he gathered with the help of his mother, and puts it on a field of lettuce, which Seth then eats, and is used as a way to show Horus's dominance over Seth, because Seth has been made to look like the submissive party of a sexual encounter between the two figures.
I mean, I'm projecting my modern sensibilities on this, obviously, but like,
Yes.
who sits there and says, "Right, let's make up a story"? Right, I'll tell you what's going to happen. But the one thing I'm going to stipulate: there has to be lettuce.
Yeah.
Otherwise, just like,
Well, and actually, the lettuce is an important part of it, because there's a particular Egyptian lettuce that when you break it open, there's a fluid in it that happens to look an awful lot like seminal fluid.
it all
So,
makes sense. Yeah.
so of course, well, why is this in my lettuce? Okay, let's make up a story
Well,
about.
that's interesting. So, is it an etiological story? So, etiology. I keep talking about this, which
Yeah.
are forms of stories that are attributing explanation to certain phenomena. You know,
Mhm.
to either names or places, things, people, stuff, whatever. In this case, like seminal fluid containing lettuces. Like, how can we explain this? I know there's definitely something to the god.
Yeah, exactly. And I always wonder, like, how we got to that particular point. Like, was it we had this story and then they kind of looped in this to explain the lettuce, or was it someone noticed this lettuce and just kind of riffed and just went, well, okay, let's there's
Campfire stories, and then
yeah,
like
exactly.
300 years later it's part of an organized religious movement. You're like, hang on, I made that up 300 years ago for a laugh from my mates.
Yeah,
What the
exactly.
fuck?
It was just a dirty joke that people started taking seriously. And yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So, so you future projects you're looking to do, I believe, write another book. Well, not another book. To take this book and expand it by, by 100%. I think,
Yeah.
But I was wondering whether, in doing that, you would be interested, because I think there's certainly, from a marketing point of view, there's an absolute appetite for all things sort of biblical, right?
Hmm.
Because atheism is a growing demographic, like we talked about, and there are podcasts aplenty, including mine, not podcasts, YouTube channels, whatever, where it's all about deconstructing sort of biblical claims. But I think there's a huge interest in the biblical pantheon, or the Canaanite pantheon, or whatever you want to call
Yeah.
the pantheon. Would you be interested in including that, where you can take actually Baal and all of these different gods at the time, and Yahweh, and kind of have a play around with the ideas of who they were, and
Absolutely. That is one of that along with including the Greeks and Indian
you would do
mythology.
that. You would.
Yes. Because I mean, the reason I didn't include the Greeks in the first book is because I, only had um, so much time and so many pages to work with, and it's been done. So I'm being selective in what Greek figures, but
What's your
particularly
criteria?
ones that have a relevance today, that we can, the ones that relate to social issues. I mean, like Zeus. I will talk about Zeus and why I hate Zeus, and as
I
kind
like
of the
that. I like that, and that's
yeah,
a nice way of selling. Of that makes the book interesting. Actually, would be like, here, I'm going to tell you about Zeus and why I hate him.
yeah, yes.
And I like that. I like that idea.
And something that I've been doing on TikTok, which I haven't been on for a while, but you can find me on TikTok. I'm going to start doing it again at Fletcher Mythology. I started doing pieces about queer gods, and how, obviously, noting that, look, human sexuality is an internal thing, and these are characters that do not have actual internal lives, but talking about Athena as an asexual figure, because her virginity and so forth is one of the paramount aspects of who Athena is, and thus getting some representation that way. And Apollo's a twink, but although bisexual, and so, and I think in finding that, I found kind of an interesting way for me to deal with classical myth and bring out other issues there.
Because at the end of the day, you know, you've got to have a unique selling point, I suppose. What would make your book, you know, different from others? So yeah, no, that sounds really fascinating. I'd be fascinated to read that.
Yeah, but as far as expanding into Judeo-Christian stuff, certainly there's going to be that. Baal is a figure that is not only very important in the Bible as kind of the antagonist to Yahweh in many stories, but also where we eventually get the name Beelzebub from, which becomes a term for the devil. And frankly, that's not very fair to Baal, because Baal was an important figure in his culture. And I would love to kind of pick apart Yahweh / Elohim / so forth, and it's not a theological text, right? But I think by looking at the various the milieu of beliefs around the Canaanite Hebrew people, you can get a lot of insight into that. So yeah, Yahweh will, and many of his regional variations will be covered in the forthcoming book. Yeah,
brilliant. I was just going to say I need to reread this, because you've got a section on some of the Mesopotamian gods, and I'm writing a book on the Exodus, and there's looking into the whole sort of, you know, the surrounding ancient Near East and the influences. So I must dip back into yours.
Yeah, and of course you have to look at Egypt too, and Egyptian history, which doesn't support the idea of a mass exodus of Hebrew slaves very strongly.
No, not very much, or and by not very much, I mean not at all. So yeah,
that's a good way of putting that. Yes,
there is that. So okay, let's start wrapping this up. So if you were to make a god from scratch, what would you do?
Okay,
what would be your coolest god? It's like making up a superhero.
Yeah, well, he would be a trickster.
Right.
And actually, I'm gonna take back that pronoun and say they would be a trickster, because I think a non-binary god
could play even more tricks.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, the idea of a god who judges and tells you that what you're doing is wrong and you're going to suffer for eternity for that, no, I'm not down with that. If I had a god, it would be a very laid back god who, like many tricksters, just kind of like to screw around, but without the sexual assault. It's a consensual.
I love that. I like that caveat. Yeah, he likes to screw around, but he's not so big on sexual assault. Just putting it out there. Or they are not so big.
Yes, they can be super horny like all of your other gods, but they respect consent. And I think it would be a god that explained the weirdness in the world, like the platypus. Like, how does that exist? Well,
there needs to be an etiological story about that. That's for sure.
Yes, I mean, you know, we have a lot of myths about gods getting drunk and creating ugly people and things like that, and that speaks to me. I think a really chill, non-binary trickster deity who smokes pot and just does dumb stuff. Are
you just basically projecting yourself here? You're turning yourself into a god. I'm going to do a god, and they will have a beard.
I mean, isn't that what everyone does, though? Isn't that what? No, I'm not non-binary, so that's if only. But yeah, I mean, that's what we do, right? We project who we think we are or who we want to be, and create concepts. Yeah, exactly so.
Okay, so I've got some quick fire questions for you.
Okay.
So you're not allowed to think too much about them. So
Okay.
just wrap this up. Favorite evil god?
Seth,
Right. Okay. So who is Seth?
the Egyptian god of chaos and storms,
Why is he
and
particularly evil? What's his most evil thing he does?
he kills Osiris, and then of course he fights with Horus for decades and has lots of fun stories. He's the one who eats the semen lettuce. So
Yeah. Is that already in my top one god?
yeah, right.
So favorite movie of all time?
Like mythologically related, or
no, favorite movie.
oh, just favorite movie of all time. Oh shit. Boy. Since I can't come up with anything else right now, and because I'm thinking about myth, I'll say Thor Ragnarok is one of the best Marvel movies, and of course has Loki and Thor and Ragnarok in it. So, and it's Taika Waititi, who is amazing.
Yeah, he's cool. Ticks all the boxes. Favorite fiction book?
I, as a librarian, a book called The Witch's Heart, and it is a kind of a journey through Norse mythology from the perspective of one of Loki's wives, who gives Angrboda, who gives birth to all these monsters. And it's like Madeline Miller's Circe or Song of Achilles, but with Norse myth. And it's slightly sapphic and really, really good. And it hasn't gotten enough praise and attention. So I'll go with that one.
Which is Heart. Good, excellent. Favorite non-fiction book?
Myth education. No. Yeah. I really loved I'll Be Gone in the Dark, the story of the searching for the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer, by Michelle McNamara. And it's also a story of Michelle McNamara, who of course died very suddenly before she was able to complete the book, and just before the guy was actually caught. And it's a really wonderful true crime book if you're into that sort of thing.
Interesting. Okay, if there's going to be an impending apocalypse, and you have to go into a bunker for a month, right? You can take 3 people with you. None of your family.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say I have 3 people that live with me right now.
Yeah,
so, boy, Taika Waititi, because he's a treasure and must be saved. Say also human treasure Betty White, who, she's going to be 100 years old soon. So
who's Betty White?
Betty White, oh my gosh, from the Golden Girls.
Oh, right. Okay. I assumed they'd all died. So yeah,
no. I would say Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but unfortunately we missed that one.
I asked you that question a couple of years too late. Sorry.
Yeah. And boy, third one, someone cute, right. someone who's nice to look at.
Right. So I often think whether I would take people I disagree with quite a bit, because if you're going to be stuck down there for a month, let's have a bloody good argument.
For sure.
I'll probably take William Lane Craig. Just like, right, mate, I've got a few things to sort out with you, and we've got a month to do it non-stop.
And you would not run out of things to talk about. That's for sure.
That's for sure.
Yeah, that's a good choice.
And then I don't know, maybe Richard Carrier, just give me a bit of like tag team, and then maybe a Rabbi Singer or someone. Then we could all just let's have a month talking God.
You went very intellectual.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, you're like, I'll take someone cute. Yes, yeah. Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you for the time you spent with us today. And anyone watching this, I really do advise you go and get Myth Education. It's a fantastic book. I believe some classes even use this as a text. Is that right?
I use it for my class because it cuts down on what I have to say to them, because they can just read what I had to say to them. And I found out other classes are using it as well, which is cool and flattering and kind of terrifying too.
Yeah, cool. Well, it's a really great book, beautiful book, love it. And it's been great to talk to you, and we'll have to do this again sometime and talk some more mythology, because there's endless sort of resources to pull on in terms of when you want to talk myth. I mean, you must have, you know, myth coming out of your ears.
Yes.
But thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Where can people find you?
So you can find me, really the only social media I use anymore is TikTok, because I want to be a Gen Z, but I'm not, at Fletcher Mythology. And yeah, that's the best place to find me. And I will have more myth related content coming soon there. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much. Take care. And for anyone watching this, you know, please like and subscribe and do like crazy YouTube stuff, and tune in for future interviews, and as ever, question everything.